I'm going to talk about algae, fuel or feed, and the reasons why we should be looking at these things. The world is resource limited right now in food, fuel, fresh water. New solutions have to be found. Malthus made predictions that the world would run out of food quickly in the late 1800s because the use of food was going up linearly, the production of food, but the population was going up logarithmically. And luckily, Malthus was wrong because there were quantum leaps every generation in food production by new technologies coming on. We also have to remember that in the temperate areas, there were traditional biofuels till about 60, 70 years ago. 20% of the land of Europe and North America was covered by this biofuel. This was oats that fueled all the farming, fueled the horses, the mules, and the laborers. This was taken out. This meant 20% of land became now available for producing food instead of fuel. So this argument, fuel versus food, is not a new argument. We also have to remember that one of those quantum leaps in production was domestication and breeding of crops. So just to give you an idea, these pictures are to scale. They are true. It isn't as if one amplified one. You can see that what the American Indians found by 1492 changed into that little stuff, and now it's big hybrid corn. So to quickly domesticate algae, if we're interested in algae, our only hope is genetic engineering, because there's very little biodiversity in algae. The algae that people are interested in have no sex. So you don't have the diversity that you can deal with by breeding. So if you want to put new genes in, you have to do it by genetic engineering. And we have to remember that the ability to adapt is a function of the DNA of a species. If it doesn't have the gene isn't there. So in breeding, you can breed and cross all you want to, but if the gene isn't there, you reach a glass ceiling eventually with all our crops we have in most cases. And the only way to get above the glass ceiling is to add DNA from somewhere else. So if we look at algae, they are very interesting for biofuels. Typically, they contain about 25% triglycerides. If we're dealing with algae, cyanobacteria don't contain much triglycerides. They contain only phospholipids and glycolipids, so they're less interesting for food. But the algae do have a lot of potential. I was asked if you could grow algae for biofuel just about the time I retired, and my immediate answer was no, they're undomesticated. So they said, oh, read this DOE report and see what you can find. Well, the DOE, the American Department of Energy, had this huge project on algae for a long time, and they closed the project in '96 because the best people could do was make algal oil with a break-even of $70 a barrel, and the DOE decided oil would never reach a price like $70 a barrel, so they stopped the project. But the report had a lot of interesting information about the drawbacks that people were having. One of them was that a lot of the people dealing with algae are what I called alchemical engineers. They would put one algal species in a pond, and they couldn't understand why, but it had transmorphed to another species in about 3 months. They couldn't figure out why this would happen. In agriculture, we call it weeds. In biotechnology, you call it contamination. Also, their results were unrepeatable. They were using species that were used to living in the ocean, not used to living on land. And if you look at how they were growing algae, they were growing them in open ponds like this. So you can imagine the first time a seagull flew over and dropped something there, you had quite a good contamination. Worse yet, if the seagull decided to take a bath in it. A lot of energy went to production because mixing, just the machinery of mixing and the depth of water they were using was incredibly great. Or some people were growing algae in structures like this. Well, you can imagine that the capital cost of a structure like this is very expensive. So you can't make biofuels in something like this. People lowered the cost. They grow algae in greenhouses like this or outdoors like this. But imagine the first time a 100-kilometer wind comes by when you have hanging bags of algae. The algae will be somewhere else. Then another major problem people had with algae was they're the same, more or less, the same specific gravity as water, and they're very small. So they have to buy $500,000 high-speed Westphalia centrifuges to get them out of solution. The energy there is almost as much, in just getting them out of solution, is almost as much as you'll get from the algae. So basically, algae have been cultivated commercially for products like this. Beta-carotene that goes in capsules that are 100 yen per capsule. Well, this is not algae for biofuel. So we decided still we had to lower the cost. I went to the Institute, basically the Institute of Advanced Hindsight, thinking about research, what should have been done. I wrote a report summarizing what I thought could be done to domesticate algae. This turned into a business plan and into a company. But if we look at algae just straightforward, they have about 20 times the potential of yield compared to corn or soy. Why is this? First of all, you use all the sunlight all year round, because if you keep the algae in exponential phase, you don't lose a photon of light. You think of a crop, part of the year there's no crop on the ground and it's germinating, and it doesn't use all the land area much of the year. The other thing is you can add, crops are deficient in carbon dioxide. With all the carbon dioxide that we're talking about going up, it's still insufficient for crop growth. Carbon dioxide and of course water in our crops, our land crops are limiting. Water is no problem with the algae, and carbon dioxide is no problem because there's plenty of flue gas or other sources of carbon dioxide. You can grow them on land. The best land to grow them is deserts near the sea. So we're talking about using new land that has never been used for agriculture. Because where do you want to grow your algae? Where there's the most sunlight, that's plus minus 30 degrees from the equator. That's not where most of our crops are being grown right now. And there is a lot of CO2 in such places, especially countries where they have natural gas. Natural gas comes out of the ground mixed with carbon dioxide. The carbon dioxide is separated and thrown to the environment when they compress the natural gas into liquid natural gas. And of course, you harvest all the algae. In a crop, you only use a quarter of the crop. 1/4 is grain, 1/4 is stem, half is roots. So you're actually using only a quarter of what you're actually harvesting. In crops, a lot of the fertilizer that you put on runs off into lakes, into streams. With algae, you can control the fertilization, so you use 100% of the fertilizer. And of course, if you're growing in a closed system, you don't have to use as much pesticides to keep contamination down. But there are a lot of technical problems, the choice of organisms. We chose organisms that have a high growth rate and density, and of course that are non-toxic, that are known already to be used in things like feeding fish, especially young larvae are often fed algae. Transformation is a major problem. When we started, we would get every once in a while a colony, transgenic colony, and it took 6 weeks to see it. Now we have repeatable transformations. We see colonies in 7 to 10 days. The most important thing in agriculture is to use everything. Use the whole crop. So even if you're interested in biofuels and you have 25% oil, you have 75% left. And the question is, what can you do with that? And the most interesting thing is a lot of it's protein, a lot of it's good protein. Our decision was not to try to make the oil different, but to make all the rest of the algae different so that we have high value added from the algae, because production costs are still too expensive. Harvest costs, cooling, and a reliable platform are the biggest problems. Later we realized that we have problems in expression levels of our new genes that we're putting in, and we're doing a lot of genomics research on that, which I won't go into. So the first thing we did to prevent contamination was we put 2 different genes in that conferred herbicide resistance. And we can use less than 1 micromolar of each of the herbicides in the solution to make sure that we don't have contamination from other algae. We're also working on antimicrobial proteins to keep down bacterial and fungal infections, and they will also be useful in animal feed as non-antibiotic antimicrobials, which actually increase the efficiency of animal feed. So you can see this is what we got, submicromolar levels of herbicides. We're very proud of ourselves. One of our competing companies in the United States chose a different herbicide, Monsanto's favorite, glyphosate, but to kill the wild type, they have to use 1 millimolar, 1,000 times more than we're using. So what they have is uneconomic. Now, should we target biofuels in general? Oil is going for $600 to $800 a ton. Animal feed is a very interesting market. Grain is missing some of the key nutrients for monogastric animals. Lysine and methionine are needed. There are a lot of enzymes you could put in. They put in a lot of enzymes into animal feed. They put in synthetic DL-methionine. And the interesting thing is people want more and more fish, and the carnivorous fish are allergic to soybean meal. So there's a big competition there. And what they use a lot in animal feed, less and less because of the price, is fish meal. Fish meal runs from $1,400 a ton to $2,000 a ton. And the supply of fish meal had been steady for a while, but now the production with the overfishing of the ocean has gone way down. In 2009, it was about 5 million tons. Last year, it should have been less because there was an El Nino. And the interesting thing is that algae can replace fish meal 1-to-1 by weight. There are a lot of studies have shown this. Now, this is most peculiar. Even though the algae have very good amino acid composition, they have a little less protein than fish meal, and they're also less digestible. So the fact that they can replace fish meal 1-to-1 doesn't make nutrient sense unless there's some sort of probiotic. And this is before the algae have been domesticated. So in our domestication, we're trying to make a better enriched fish meal because that is a much better market. If you're a commercial company and you're not selling your biofuels at a highly subsidized rate, you want to deal with something better. So the first thing is we're putting in genes that increase methionine and lysine. We had a director who got mixed up and called it methionine, so we took out a trademark on methionine. And we're putting in the different genes that will elevate the levels, and we're seeing that we can do this, but we need better promoters. One of the most interesting additives that we're interested in is fish growth hormone. There are a lot of studies showing that fish growth hormone increases the rate of fish growth. There's the transgenic salmon that are about to be released by the FDA after about 10 years. Instead of 2 years to get to commercial weight, they get to commercial weight in 1 year, and they use half the amount of feed. Now, this is not surprising. This could have been done by genetics. It would have been much harder. We know that we've done that in poultry. Poultry growth hormone has been bred up in poultry. That's why you can now get a chicken at commercial weight in 45 days instead of 6 months. Used to be a year when I was younger to get a chicken to commercial rate. It's only because they bred up the level of avian growth hormone. Now, you can also supply the growth hormone exogenously, and we're interested in that very much because fish growth hormone is universal among the fish. The same hormone works on all fish, so you wouldn't have to make transgenic fish to do it. You could feed them small amounts of algae with a fish growth hormone. You would keep biodiversity of fish better because you could then take any fish and use it. And the hormone does have a high turnover, so if you stop feeding the growth hormone a few days before harvest, there's no residual recombinant DNA in the fish intestines. There'd be no residual hormone, exogenous hormone in the fish. And you wouldn't have some of the environmental worries that they have with a transgenic salmon because the fish are not transgenic, so if they somehow or other swim out to the ocean, it wouldn't be a problem. You don't have to breed triploids like they did in the salmon to get sterility. You could grow the fish in sea pens, and your fish meal would contain probiotics and other valuable components. And another missing component in a lot of animal feeds is fish oil, which they take from fish from the sea. And what is fish oil? It's just algal oil. The fish do not change the triglycerides they get. Different algae have different oils. One of the interesting species there is Nanochloris, which makes the precursor for all of the omega-3s, and you could transform it with elongases to make any omega-3 you want for your fish. Now, algae have very biodiverse metabolism, so they have many different substrates that you can engineer to novel products. So if they're high value, the production is almost free because you sell the rest of the algae for fish meal or whatever. So what the bong is going to hit now. Okay. So we're looking at all the different feed additives. So instead of buying exogenous feed additives, they're already there in the algae. So we're looking at vitamins, pigments, extractables, but you can also think of pharma products, etc. Now, what if there's an inadvertent leak? There have always been angels out there worried about introducing new organisms into the environment. In this case, the angels were probably right. But what we're doing in the algae is taking out genes that are needed to live in the ocean, but not needed to live in our culture. So we're taking out the genes in the carbon capture system, carbonic anhydrase and rubisco. When you're living with high CO2, as we have in our production systems, you don't need these genes. In the ocean, the algae are dead without them. So if there's an inadvertent leak of our algae to the ocean, they cannot compete with organisms in the ocean, so there's no problem there. We also saw the harvesting cost. If you're growing your algae in highly dense cultures, there are very cheap flocculants that are non-toxic that can deal with them. So in summary, marine algae can work as a fish meal substitute. They do not compete for land and water with agriculture. They sequester industrial carbon dioxide. They're fertilizer efficient. They have high productivity. You can get multiple products. They do need domestication, and the easiest way to domesticate is using transgenics. And they can be the next nail in Malthus's coffin for both fuel and feed. And of course, we'll breed them according to market demands. Now, there'll be many different products. We could saturate markets very quickly. The best thing that we could do is get to production costs that are competitive with soybean. Then parts of the jungle could return to being jungle instead of soybean production. So we have to thank our group leaders at Transalgae for helping out on this. And if there are any unanswered questions and unquestioned answers, I'd be happy to deal with them. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Dressel.